friends, we had an understanding of Indian society based on the specific perspectives, and as we know that we had the different perspective for analyzing the society in the various forms. I think if you try to see that what this perspective does, it basically tries to look into the same phenomenon in the different ways, or one can say that the realities are to be seen not from one side, it has to be seen from the various side. So, in that way these perspectives are instrumental in expressing the so called the voices of the realities in a different way. And when we try to speak about those realities which are seen as a subject or which are seen as an object, these identities are to be expressed in a better way through the various perspectives. Like when we try to speak about the culture, or when we try to speak about the aspect of civilization, I think they are visible, but they are to be expressed, and the perspectives are going to be an instrumental values in expressing these various these realities. So, keeping these aspects in mind and trying to uncover the Indian social realities, we have another prominent perspective which we try to see it in terms of the civilizational perspective. The civilizational perspective, if you try to see, is a perspective which can be of use for the sociologist and social anthropologist, because the understanding of the civilization has definitely something to do with the history, but apart from that those disciplines which also incorporate history in one or the other way also can utilize the civilizational perspective. So, in that way civilizational perspective have its own utility in terms of understanding the trajectory, in terms of understanding the history, in terms of linking the history with the present. I think these are the ways in which we can see the civilizational perspective. And in this lecture, we are basically trying to express the things in three different aspects. One of course, is trying to understand the meaning of civilization, the civilizational perspective to be more focused. The second thing was to speak about the pioneers, and in that we have two prominent persons with whom we try to link up the contribution of civilizational perspective. One is N.K. Bose and another is Surajit Sinha. I think these are the people who tries to understand or use the civilizational perspective in a specific sense. We also have certain other peoples, like we have Professor B. S. Cohen also, and many other people who try to use the civilizational perspective in a specific sense. Now, to be more crisp, to be more clear about this perspective, the civilizational perspective, it stresses on the complex structures, of the great and the little tradition. The complex structures of the great and the little traditions. It includes the study of the tribals, the rural and the urban culture, the tribal, the rural and the urban culture. So, in that way, if you try to see, it tries to cover the entire Indian society, the tribe, the rural and the urban, which are seen as the distinctive features of the Indian society. This perspective also views on the civilization as an organization of specialists. The organization of the specialist, in a sense that it tries to build up the functional relations to the folk society. So, the organizational specialist in terms of the functional relations to the folk societies. I think there are certain technical terms which are being used, and I will try to deliberate upon these terms in a specific sense. The civilization perspective also involves the study of combination of the various subjects, like if you try to see the combinations of subjects, then we have the so called analysis of the ancient, the classical and the medieval text. The ancient, classical and the medieval text. We also try to see that we have the administrative records, that is another important aspect. Administrative records, which are another aspects of understanding the ground realities. Then we also have along with that the analysis of these issues which pertains to the village, the caste, the tribe and many such realities, and it basically tries to see it in terms of the unity of diversity. And I think that is what is the essence of the civilizational perspective, that it tries to see the sort of unity in diversity, and in that mode it tries to see the linkage. So, on the one hand the unity which has to be confirmed, which has to be retained, and on the other hand the expression of the diversities, how they can be linked to each other is an important aspect that one has to see. In order to understand the civilization, one has to see that how civilization has to be seen in a specific setting. I think as I said earlier also, like when we try to speak about the civilization has something to do with the culture, or rather I will say the various cultures in that sense as such. So, if I put it in a very brief, I think the culture which has the specific cultural traits, and these cultural traits are carried forward from generation to generation, and certain traits which are stagnant or which are going to be the repository for the future generation. At the higher end of development, we try to see it in terms of the development of a specific civilization. So, we try to see that how the things are linked, the specific culture and their smaller units, the cultural traits which are been filtered through generations, through time, and these cultural traits which are stable, which are fixed, which are going to be continued, they are accommodated in the path of development, and we try to see it in terms of an end product, that is the civilization in that sense as such. So, we are talking about that how there should be the combination of the two issues, as we said earlier also. We have on the one hand the little tradition, and on the other hand we have the great tradition. I think just to focus upon these issues, that what are the little traditions and what are the great traditions. The little traditions are basically those entities, those aspects of culture which are going to be having a parochial appeal, and these little traditions which are unwritten, undocumented, they are basically passed from one generation to another through the oral mode, and their acceptance, as I said, they are parochial. So, in terms of its spread, they are having the limited space in which they are there. And on the other hand, if you try to see the great traditions are those traditions which are seen at the macro level, maybe the national level or any bigger entity in that sense. So, the great traditions are basically those traditions which are having the wider acceptance. So, we can see that they are universal in nature, they have a universal appeal. And I think with regard to that, if you try to speak about, I think we had the significant works by Robert Redfield and McKim Marriott, who tried to see these traditions, the little and the great traditions, in their own way. Especially, we try to find out that associated with this particular issue is the process of universalization and parochialization. The two terms which has been used by McKim Marriott while analyzing the shift from one tradition to another. So, when McKim Marriott speaks about the universalization, the basic understanding is that when the little traditions through time are accepted at a wider level, at the macro level. So, the little tradition shifting towards the great tradition, this process is called as universalization. On the other hand, when the macro traditions, the universal traditions, they are gradually been absorbed and accommodated in the specific regions in a specific fashion, or they have been taken up and adopted in their own way at the local level, at the regional level. So, then that is the parochial reach is there, then we try to see that this is the process of parochialization. So, the universal, that is the great traditions, are shifting towards the little tradition. So, one thing is important, that both the traditions, either it is the great traditions or the little traditions, I think there is an interplay between both of them. So, they are not seen, or they should not be seen in terms of isolation, rather they are to be seen in terms of exchange, they are to be seen in terms of an interplay which is there between both the traditions. Like when we try to speak about the exchange, the little becoming great traditions and the great becoming the little traditions, I think that whole process involves the shifting of the acceptance of the traditions in a specific sense. And in that way, for the student of the civilization, both the aspects are going to be important. That is, the little traditions also have their own value, and in the similar way the great traditions have their own value. Like if you try to see the tribe, the tribal culture, I think they can be parochial, they can have the limited exchange or limited transmission, and they can be seen as restricted to the specific region. But on the other hand, if we try to speak about the city, the town or the bigger entity, I think their exchange, their acceptance is going to be high, but there is always an interplay between both of them. So, if we try to understand the civilization, the Indian civilization in a specific sense, I think we have to incorporate both the tribal culture and we also have to incorporate the so called urban culture, and that is the way in which we have to understand the totality of the civilization. So, one thing which we can communicate is that the civilization has to do with the understanding of both the traditions, the little and the great traditions, the exchange, the adaptation, the accommodation of the one culture over the other, the modifications which have been there. All these things are going to be part and parcel for understanding and analyzing the civilization. And when we try to speak about the civilizational perspective, I think it tries to incorporate both the elements in that. Now, we try to speak about another important aspect, that when we try to understand the civilization, what is going to be important as such. So, when we try to speak about the civilization, we have to have the first thing which is required in the case of the civilizational perspective is the notion of cataloging. The notion of cataloging is important because it tries to understand the various cultural traits, rather we can say that the cultural traits in the listed form are seen as cataloging. So, the cultural traits which are being listed, that what is the possible cultural traits that we can have, if a listing of that of course is the first step when we try to approach towards the civilizational perspective. So, the cultural traits are to be documented in terms of listing in that sense as such. Then second important thing which has been talked about by B.S. Cohen is that we have to have an understanding about the cultural essence. The cultural essence. By that we mean to say that the essential underlying processes of any culture are seen as the cultural essence. Means, if we have to understand that culture, we can't ignore them. So, we have to see every aspect of a culture is not to be covered. We have to see that aspect of the culture which of course is seen as the core, and that core is seen as an underlying process on the basis of which the specific culture is being celebrated. So, the second important aspect that one has to see with regard to the civilizational perspective is to have an understanding about the cultural essence. And the third thing is the notion of the cultural communication. The notion of cultural communication is again important because we have to take care of those enduring elements, that are transmitted from society to society. So, the cultural communication is again important because those enduring or sustaining elements of the culture, they are to be transmitted, because if the culture is not transmitted, then it is going to be died, because once it is not moving to the next generation, then we say that the culture is lost. So, the important thing in that sense of course is that the cultural communication is equally important, because it tries to understand the culture in terms of its utility, and that aspect of the culture is going to be retained in the future or in the next generation, which has certain amount of utility, and in that way we try to see the whole understanding about the civilization. So, the cataloging is an important aspect. We have the cultural essence, we have the cultural communications. So, if we develop those things, then definitely it will lead to the formation of the civilizational perspective. Like what a civilization must be, and here Robert Redfield says that it has an identity and also having a delimitation. So, a culture has its own identity as well as it has its own delimitation in terms of the scope, in terms of the issue, and it has the notion of unity and it has a specific form. So, these are the different aspects of a specific civilization. That is when we try to speak about the civilization, how we try to understand it, that it has a specific identity, it has the delimitation in terms of time frame, in terms of span, in terms of space, it has an element of unity across the various cultures, and it has a specific form, and in that way the understanding of civilization can be developed. The unity of civilization has to be seen in terms of the aspect which has its own substantial qualities. Now, a civilization to Redfield in a very specific sense is a civilization like the other culture may be thought of not as a perfectly heterogeneous elements, but rather we have to see the oneness of the attributes that refer to the very much of even all of it. The basic idea in that sense of course is that it is not the notion of heterogeneous elements which has to be celebrated, but how these heterogeneous elements has certain amount of oneness, how these heterogeneous elements have the notion of unity, that is going to be important, which has to be seen in terms of the even aspect in that sense as such. That is going to be an important issue. So, in the civilizational perspective, if you try to see the various contributions, the pioneers, N.K. Bose, as I referred earlier, is one of an legendary. Then we have Surjit Sinha, and also we have B.S. Cohen, whose contribution we can say can be an important with regard to the civilizational perspective. They try to, all these people, they try to understand the historicity of, and not only the historicity, but the continuity and the linkage, the historicity, the continuity and the linkage of the various structures of the Indian society. So, when we try to see the various structures which are based on the specific cultures, they are to be seen in terms of the historicity, in terms of their continuity and in terms of their linkage. If that is there, we are trying to see these assemblage of structures in terms of a bigger entity, which we try to call it as the civilizational. Now, let us try to speak about the contribution of N.K. Bose. Of course, Nirmal Kumar Bose was a legendary when we try to see the civilizational perspective. He was born in Bengal in the earlier phase. He was being seen as a person who tried to equally measure the pursuit of science and the service of humanity. So, he tries to have the blend of the science and humanity in terms of his contribution, in terms of his recognition about the discipline. Now, he tried to see that initially, if you try to see, he was having a training in geology, and later on he realized his interest in anthropology, and then he had made some significant contribution which are seen as part of the civilizational perspective. So, his training in anthropology and geology at Calcutta University was significant for making or shaping his contribution as a civilizational person, and he has been the part of the department of anthropology at the University of Calcutta, and later on he also has been part of the human geography in 1959. Apart from these contributions, these trainings, these academic positions, he also has been given with a very prestigious position of being the director of the Anthropological Survey of India. Anthropological Survey of India, and this Anthropological Survey of India, which started in 1959, and we try to see that his contribution was seen not only in this Anthropological Survey of India. He has been in the office of the Commissioner for the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribe communities at the different phases of time. Anthropological Survey of India definitely is a national body which tries to explore the various ethnic communities across the nation in detail, and in that way I think the contribution of N.K. Bose is going to be significant as such. One thing that has to be shared here is N.K. Bose was basically the follower of Gandhi, and the aspect of humanism, the humanity in that sense has been because of his association with Gandhi, and Bose was interested in Gandhi's idea of creation of the new society in India, that how we can have the understanding of the new society, and this new society was a dream of the Gandhi. Maybe when we try to talk about the Swaraj or certain other contributions, but how this Gandhi's contribution of new society has been carried forward by N.K. Bose, because he was a strong follower of Gandhi. So, he had carried forward this mission, and he wanted to have the understanding of the living man's idea by looking into those things in action, especially the how Gandhi tries to construct or understand the world. In the similar way, he also wanted to have the contribution of the human being with regard to looking to the realities. So, as an anthropologist, Bose was not a narrow specialist. He was having a wide spectrum of trainings. He conducted the archaeological excavations as archaeological excavations at Mayurganj. So, in that way his training as an archaeologist, as an anthropologist was going to have the significant real outcome. Bose wrote much on Bengali and English rather than trying to restrict it to some other regional languages. His best published book, if you try to see, is the Bengali book Maben o Prachin. It was basically in Bengali, so having its restricted outcome, but another significant work which we try to rate is the Hindu Samajer Gadan, that was seen as one of the landmark with regard to his contribution towards anthropology and social anthropology proper. The first two collections, especially the Maben o Prachin and especially some of his other works, they were trying to focus upon the imaginative account of the Hindu social structure, in which the perspective of ethnography, Indology and the history were combined together. So, we see that how he was trying to blend upon or have a synthesis of the various issues. So, ethnography, Indology and history, how they are to be combined to have a better understanding about the civilization. And I think that combination is going to be important, because that is the way in which we can have the real understanding about the Indian civilization. Now, Bose also has written the significant works with regard to the temple architecture. And he was having a very good understanding about the architect, what it wants to communicate. Especially he wrote on the professional skill technology, and also he tries to understand the skill technology, especially with regard to the shifting cultivation, followed by how the various crafts of the Indian society, are to be seen in terms of combining together. Like pottery is one, which he tries to see that it has its spread in the various regions, especially Odisha, West Bengal and part of Bihar, and even it has its spread in the neighboring places going to Bangladesh and certain other regional territories. So, in that way we try to see that how the pottery is going to, as a skill, is going to have certain amount of unification, certain amount of distinction is there, but apart from that the specific craft of pottery, how it can be seen having its filtration across the state, across the region, which is going to be an important issue. And as an anthropologist, he wrote on the society and culture in India, he covers the range of studies, especially his contribution on the Zhuang tribe is going to be significant, which was in Odisha, and his understanding about the Zhuang tribe, and also he tries to understand the metropolitan city of Calcutta. So, if you try to see the range, so on the one hand we have the tribal culture, on the other we have the understanding about the city life and how he is trying to blend up these issues, and he was also the editor of a prominent journal, that is Men in India, which has been seen as one of the pioneering journal in the field of anthropology proper. N.K. Bose in that sense is seen as a great anthropologist who tries to present the single framework involving the approaches of the ethnography, the approach of the Indology and the historian, and he was of the opinion that in order to understand the Hindu civilization in a real sense, anthropologists should go beyond the applied aspect. They have to have the blending of these disciplines, so that we can have a better understanding about these issues. If you try to sharply speak about the specific works which N.K. Bose has done, is the Hindu Samajer Gadan, that was in Bengali, and later on it was been translated by Andre Bete in the structure of Hindu society. Another work is the studies on Gandhism, because he was the follower of Gandhi. So, another important contribution was the studies on Gandhism, and then he has also the work related to cultural anthropology, that was his area of interest. And another significant work which he tries to speak about is peasant life, which is trying to see in the Indian society in unity and diversity, peasant life in India in terms of a study in unity in diversity. Unity and diversity, and then he also speaks about the problem of national integration. So, I think if you try to see his important contributions, it involves the range of the studies. On the one hand we have the structure of Hindu society, on the other we have the understanding of the peasant life, and also we have the issue of national integration, which is going to be significant when we try to see the contribution of N.K. Bose. Now, specifically if we try to focus upon his contribution in terms of the civilizational perspective, he tries to emphasize upon bringing together the ethnology and Indology. Ethnology and Indology, how they have to be merged together, that is the use of the textual literature and trying to have its understanding from the ethnology, from some field realities in that sense as such, that is the best possible way to have the reconstruct of the Indian civilization. Because if you try to structure or if you try to understand the reconstruct of the Indian civilization in terms of structure, we have to have the blending of ethnology and Indology, so that it can have the vital understanding about the Indian civilization. Bose has also done certain studies with regard to the tribals of Chota Nagpur area. He had not only understood the tribals in terms of its own uniqueness, but how these tribals are to be seen with regard to having it spread from one area to another, and the linkage is to be seen through the technological development as such. The degree of geographical and the social isolations, they may be the barriers, but apart from that the technological development speaks about that how these the smaller units are going to have certain amount of diffusion of the great traditions in their own society. So, that linkage has to be seen in a proper way. So, the Bose approach to the Indian civilization can be understood in terms of the two model. One of course is the Brahminical model, Brahmanical model, which if you try to see in a very specific sense, is trying to have the caste understanding in that sense as such, and the second model is the tribal model. So, I think the two extremes, we have the two extremes in that sense, the Brahmanical model which speaks about the elite, the elitist understanding, and the tribal model which speaks about the very narrow and subjugated people in that sense as such. So, these were the two different areas, two different sphere in which we can see the understanding in that sense as such, and in that he was trying to see the notion of tribal absorption, the notion of tribal absorption which is going to be crucial with regard to its linkage with the caste. So, the tribe, how they are going to assimilate certain elements of caste, or we can see the vice versa is difficult, which he did not speak much, but Bose definitely try to reject the colonial notion of tribes, that tribes which has been understood by the colonial rulers is that they are seen as the isolated whole, they are segregated, they are seen as not having interaction with the wider society, and apart from that they did not have any technological advancement. But what N.K. Bose tried to work upon is the tribals are linked to the wider society, to the great traditions, they are having certain amount of exchange, and these exchange are going to bring about the sort of integration between the two different societies. Thus, the civilizational approach in a sense is aimed at discovering and highlighting the threads of unity. It is basically highlighting the threads of unity which are been represented in terms of binding the various ethnic groups, binding the various ethnic groups. So, in a sense we can say that the great diversity of the culture which we try to see, this great diversity of culture has to be seen in terms of having certain amount of interaction, and this interaction is having certain amount of interdependence also, which is going to assimilate, and they are going towards the wider entity, towards the wider unity. So, the two important features if you try to rate about the civilizational perspective is the unity among its component units, the unity among the various component, that is important, unity among the component unit, the smaller units, how they are composed and how they are connected in that sense as such. And another of course is the issue of distinctiveness, the distinctiveness from the other civilization. So, you have on the one hand the unity, and on the other hand you also have the distinctiveness. So, both the things are going simultaneously in that sense as such. So, we have the unity aspect also and we have the distinctiveness also. So, civilization should not be seen as a sort of the uniformity, rather it should be seen as a process which involves the multiple units which are coming together, assembling together, and they are going along, and in that way we try to see his contribution which become significant. Like when he tried to speak about the Zhuang tribes, especially he was trying to link up that how we have that non-Aryan communities which were falling broadly within the Hindu fold, but on the other hand we try to see that the Zhuang has started worshipping the Hindu goddess, and this is trying to speak about the linkage of the Zhuang tribes with the Hindu fold. So, we have that the so called non-Aryan communities, they are not to be seen as the segregated peoples, they also were trying to have certain resemblance, they also were trying to understand, or they also were trying to accommodate the great traditions. So, the Hindu goddess worship was being carried into the Zhuang tribes, and that speaks about the linkage between the tribe and the wider culture, basically the Hinduism. Then we also try to speak about certain other issues, that Bose has also tried to speak about certain other tribes of Chota Nagpur, especially the Mundas and the Orans. He spoke about the two tribes, the Mundas and the Orans, and these tribes were not only larger in size, but they were representing the higher level of technological development. So, the tribes should not be seen simply as having the simple technological equipments, rather they are to be seen in terms of having the complex technological advancement also. So, we try to find out that in the 19th century, as is raised, that the 19th century witnessed a number of social movement among the Mundas and the Orans, and these Orans tries to escape from the Hindu domination, means trying to have their own assertion in return of having the idealized past. So, they wanted to talk about the issue of purification of their own tribes by moving away from the Hindu culture, and that is how we try to see that the Sanskritic Hinduism was being put away from the so called Oran tribes, and that has been seen even in the case of the Mundas. But the important issue is that we try to see that these exchanges are taking place. It is not the one way that once things has happened, it can go back. So, we try to see through these studies of Mundas and Orans, which N.K. Bose has tried to pinpoint, that how the people can go back, or how people can have the absorption into the perichal entity, which is showing their distinctiveness. Bose also has studied about the significant communities, that is the specific caste, the Sinha caste. So, he studied the Sinha caste, basically the Sinhas of Raipur. That was another important contribution, and he was trying to see that how they were being linked to the East India companies, how the Sinhas were linked to the East India company, and later on they were going to be partner to, or they were going to assimilate with regard to the family history of Sinhas with their contribution in the as a worker, as a landowner, as a traders in that sense as such, and that is how we try to see the sort of a linkage between the Sinhas and the East India company. So, one can find out that the new economic forces which has been introduced by the British rule were basically leading to certain amount of division of labor within the caste, and the Bose contribution is to be seen in terms of that how the traditional occupations are going to be shifted, or how there is certain amount of weakening of the traditional occupations, which is been seen in the various stages. So, one can say that the typicality of the caste and its association with the British force has led to certain amount of changes in the practices of the caste system, especially trying to work upon certain issues of moving away from the traditional occupations, and in that way they were trying to make a shift. So, we can say that the classification of the various groups into the languages, into the religion, into the race, or the other things are to be seen in terms of a specific synergy, and one can find out that there is the notion of the relationship between, on the one hand, the tribal and the non-tribal in terms of Hindu civilization, and we can also see that both of them can influence each other, and we can see that this sort of linkage is going to be an important issue which has to be seen with regard to the process of change. And I think when we move further, we try to find out that N.K. Bose was also trying to depict upon the so called architecture of basically this Konark temple, and he says that the architecture of the Konark temple speaks about the glory of the past. So, we can have an understanding of the glory of the past by looking to the so called the buildings and the monuments. So, how the buildings and the monuments speaks about the people at that period of time, and we also try to see that he tries to have the understanding of the Indian civilization into the various stages, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 and stage 4, and where he was trying to speak about how these different aspects of cataloging, then the issue of cultural essence are going to be linked to each other, and in that way we have to see the unity of India. So, it is not simply speaking about the two entities separately, rather the sort of linkage which is there between the two entities, which is going to be an important issue. Parallelly, we have another significant contributor, and his contribution to be seen in terms of the civilizational perspective, that is Surajit Sinha. Surajit Sinha also was having a significant contribution in the field of the civilizational understanding. He also has been the Deputy Director of the Anthropological Survey of India, and one of his most important contribution is the study of the Bhumij tribals, the Bhumij tribes of the Bastar area and the area of Bengal. So, in that way we can say that the understanding of the tribals by Sinha also has some bearings with regard to the civilizational perspective, and some of his important themes which he tries to focus upon is the linkage between the tribe and the caste, the tribe caste continuum. That is, the linkage between the tribe and the caste put together in terms of the linkage association, not to be seen in terms of the two polarities, rather there is a continuous linkage which is going to be there in that sense. He also has spoken about the tribal movement, and apart from that he was also trying to see how we can have the understanding of the religion. So, the sociology of religion was another important area in which Surjit Sinha has tried to contribute in a significant way. And in analyzing and understanding these things, Surjit Sinha has basically used the ancient and the medieval text. So, he also was having the significant use of the Indological tools, the Indological method for understanding the distinctiveness of the caste and the tribes, that how caste and the tribes have been documented in the various ancient and the medieval text. But the important thing in that sense of course is that the tribe caste continuum are to be seen on the basis of their habitat, that is the place of living in that sense as such. They are to be seen in terms of the economy, having their own distinctive economy, the subsistence economy in that sense as such, and they are also to be seen in terms of the social interaction, which has to be seen in terms of how they are going to bring about the change in themselves. And basically for that the important thing that is required is that they should have certain amount of aspirational value, because if aspirational level is there, then only we can speak about the sort of accommodation and change. So, Sinha has basically emphasized upon that the Indian tribes which have been close similarities to the peasant societies, they were formed to have its linkage with the caste system. So, the peasantry and the tribes coming together, which basically speaks about the amalgamation of the caste values in the tribes, and in that way we try to see that when Sinha was speaking about these particular issues, especially in terms of the Redfield's scheme of the folk peasant urban continuum, he was trying to have a linkage of the peasantry and the tribes in a specific sense. Especially when we try to see his contribution, we try to see that his contribution with regard to the Bhumij tribes of the Bastar region was to be seen in terms of a specific term that is called as the Rajputization of the tribes. The Rajputization of the tribe, where of course the tribes were trying to imitate the characters of the Kshatriyas, the Kshatriya caste, and that is how the tribals they try to accommodate themselves with the Rajput characters, and not it also was been visible that the tribes are not simply imitating the Brahmins, they can also imitate the other varied groups, and that is how he was trying to see the possibilities of the changes within the tribes going along the different lines. And we also try to find out that what has happened with regard to the change in the economic patterns of these tribal groups, especially when we try to see the economic change, we try to find out that the Bhumij of Barbhan, the Bhumij tribes, the Bhumij of Barbham, they were trying to have certain amount of isolation at some period of time, and also they were trying to show certain amount of solidarities with the wider societies. And in that way we try to see that the linkage of the Bhumij with the various caste groups was seen as an important issue, which speaks about the changeability of the tribes, and the tribes should not be seen in terms of isolation, they are to be seen in terms of their relationship with the wider society. Now, we have another important aspect which can be linked to this whole notion is that Professor Sinha was trying to have the understanding of the various problems in social anthropology, especially when we try to find out that Indian population has to be approached in the three different vantage point. The first is that the primitive group may be selected for covering should have the missing link. So, if you are talking about the specific primitive group, so these primitive groups are to be seen in terms of the selection which are having certain amount of missing links, that how and when they have evolved, how they have to have their relationship with the wider world culture in that sense as such. That is one important thing that we can see in terms of the analysis. The second important thing is the selection of the groups and their theoretical understanding, which groups are we selecting and how we can have the theoretical understanding about these particular issues. And then the third important aspect that one has to see is with regard to the anthropological study of the problem, which has to be seen in terms of the national reconstruction, which has been the dream project of N.K. Bose also. So, the notion of the national reconstruction in terms of development, how we can have the national reconstruction along with development is going to be another important issue when we try to speak about the specific tribes. Now, the point that we are trying to make out is that these tribal groups which we are trying to see having its linkage with the wider society, or the wider societies have been taken up by the tribals in a specific sense, but the basic issue in that sense is that these tribals or the wider societies, whether they have certain amount of connectivity. So, one thing is negating the what you can say the linkage of the various categories, that is one possibility. Another aspect in that sense that has to be seen is that these linkages are to be seen as based on the specific studies, basic ethnology, which is going to bring about a better understanding about the linkage of the tribes with the wider people, especially his contribution with regard to the Rajputization of the tribe, which speaks about that how the Bhumis tribals, they were trying to imitate the food habits, the clothing patterns, the other aspects of the Kshatriyas, and they were trying to have certain understanding about an adaptation of the values of the Kshatriya caste. But here the important question which can be put or which can be raised is that when there is a Rajputization of the tribe, one problem that was found is that when these tribals were to go for the marriage, so they could not marry with the Kshatriyas in that sense. So, even though there are the linkage between the tribe and the caste, but the important aspect of course is even though there is Rajputization of the tribes, but these Rajputization of tribe does not make them to accommodate in terms of marriage. So, one important thing that comes out in our mind is that the changeology which is there among these little and the great traditions. So, whether the great tradition is going to adopt the little traditions, or we can see the other way around in that sense as well, whether the little traditions are going to accommodate the values of the great tradition is to be seen as a big mismatch. So, although the civilizational perspective tries to speak about the unity of the diversities, but how these diversities are to be seen in terms of unity, in a sense that is it possible that these contradictions may not be there with regard to these differences. I think that is an important question. So, the civilizational perspective basically believes on the fact that how the trajectory of the various culture of the little traditions and the great traditions, they are to be seen, but in that context what is going to be more important is that these cultural accommodation are to be seen in such a fashion that they are going to bring about the unification of the Indian society in a broader way. And this civilizational perspective in that sense speaks about the notion of uniformities and the linkage, the carrying over of the specific cultural traits across the regions, and that is how we can have the understanding of the links between the various traditions. And in that way, the civilizational perspective provides a sound ground for understanding the unity and diversity of the Indian society. So, friends, with these words, I think we had some specific readings, especially the works which have been quoted. You can just read them out, and then you can have the broader understanding about both the people and the civilizational perspective in totality as such. Thank you.